You are an image of God in the world. You are the temple of the Holy Spirit. When St. Paul says that, he's referring directly to that story of the creation of Adam.
At what point did you come to the realization that this is what I want to be able to share with others because there's beauty and meaning?
I think that's the beauty of Scripture as a whole. It has so many depths, so many different angles, right?
Symbolism is the way that you perceive unity.
We're about to jump into the story of creation in the Garden of Eden. And there's so many angles by which we can take the first bite of this apple.
Oh, that was nice.
Yeah.
you did that on
He didn't even think about it.
To me, hearing it, I see that there's beauty for sure, but it actually changes everything but how we live. Right? Maybe you can once you know this, how can you just be the same?
Welcome everyone to the COA podcast. We are so happy to have you with us today, and we are even happier to have a real treat for you today. We have a very honored guest and a friend among us, Jonathan Pajot. Jonathan, what a beautiful, beautiful gathering to have you among us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
This is great. I've been looking forward to it, definitely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And obviously we have our honored fathers with us. We have Father Gabriel, who needs no introduction, Father Joseph, whom all of you already know from the previous podcast that we did. So why don't we just jump into the conversation? We would love for all of you to get to know Jonathan. So Jonathan, if you allow me, I would really love for you to maybe let us know, who is Jonathan Pajot? What was his journey like to coming to the beauty of Orthodoxy? Share with us a little bit, please.
Definitely. I love how you say my name in French. It's perfect. That's how I'm used to hearing my name, Jonathan Pajot. So I was born here in Quebec. I was born in Sherbrooke. So it was like 2 hours from Montreal.
Yeah.
My father and my mother, they converted to Protestantism when they were teenagers, like late teenage years. It was during the Quiet Revolution, Révolution Tranquille, when everybody was, secularism was pouring into Quebec. People were leaving the churches, the Catholic churches. And my parents, they felt like the Catholicism they grew up in was very shallow and kind of cultural, that it was missing the depth that they were looking for. And so they found that in the Protestant faith. And so I grew up a pastor's kid. My dad was a Baptist minister in Sherbrooke, the Baptist church there, for about 8 years when I was young. And then he went and studied psychology at Wheaton Grad School, at Wheaton College in Illinois. And so I grew up in the Baptist church. And it's only in my maybe 20s in college when I started reading philosophy that I realized that some of the big questions were not, some of the deeper questions weren't being answered maybe in the way that I was looking for, that I had been presented a means to salvation. You could say that was the big emphasis in the churches I grew up in, but that some of the deeper philosophical questions were kind of not really even addressed or were not looked at. And that's when I started reading more profoundly, philosophy, and then ultimately reading theologians, reading the church fathers, kind of diving into the church fathers. And I really fell in love with the language of the church. As someone who had studied fine art, I had wanted to be a painter and ultimately became disillusioned with contemporary art because of how cynical it is and how kind of twice removed and ironic it is. Discovering the language of iconography, the traditional language that the church had developed almost universally, across the entire span of Christendom. If you think about it, there are very few pronouncements in the church about what to put in the images. There's some, there's very few, but there still is this kind of universal language, right? If you had been, in Egypt, or if you had gone to France, you could recognize the figure of Christ, you could recognize the figure of the Mother of God. Like there were certain tropes that were just kind of grew up in the church. And I really fell in love with that language and the liturgical language. And it helped me understand scripture much more profoundly. And ultimately, that's what led me to Orthodoxy.
Wow, that's awesome. That's really beautiful. So when you're referencing this point in your journey, how old are you at this point?
So I am about maybe 25.
Okay,
around 25. It's after I was married. I kind of went through my crisis in terms of art, but then also, just in terms of thinking. I was getting frustrated in the churches I was going to. This is also in relationship with my brother, who is also kind of interested in Christian symbolism and religious symbolism in general. So we were discussing, reading similar texts, kind of engaged with each other. And then, he was reading a lot of rabbinical works, and, reading these kind of deep rabbinical interpretation of scripture. I was like, wow, like it's so powerful. They have such a deep understanding of the relationship between the stories and everything. And I kept thinking, like, why don't we have this, in Christianity? And then I was reading kind of mystical texts, even Sufi texts, or like all these mystical texts. And I was like, wow, this whole transformational kind of aspect of religion, like, it's so beautiful. Why don't we have this in Christianity? And so then, it's really, as I read, St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Maximus and, some of the early fathers, that I realized, oh, okay, it's all there. It's all there in Christianity. It's just that I didn't know about it.
Right. It's funny because you immediately brought into our conversation that word symbolism. And obviously symbolism is something that is very deeply rooted in, I'd even say, your identity at this point as a public figure. And I know that you have a tremendous amount of content that is available for people to be able to go and access. And you have really brought to light this conversation around symbolism. But I think symbolism is not always properly understood by people. So before we even get into symbolism and why you love it so much, and why it's become something that really you want to bring forward for people to be able to understand and approach, can you help us understand what definition we should have when we hear you speak of symbolism?
Yeah. So the word symbolism, I like it in its etymological meaning. It means in Greek kind of two things thrown together.
Yes.
Sometimes it, like the place where two rivers meet, would be called the symbol of the river. And in the way that we talk about, for example, the symbol of the apostles, the idea that symbolism, what it is, it's the manner in which multiple elements are brought together into their unity. It's the pattern of unity that multiplicity participates in. That's the way to understand it. So if you think about the symbol of the apostle, like a creed, for example, what it is Christians believe a million things, right? They believe indefinite amounts of things. I can't count how many things Christians believe. And there might be actually some variations among Christians of a few little things that they prioritize or believe. But what we want to do is to take the essential elements, pull them together into a pattern, into something that we can identify as being one. And that's what I mean by symbolism. And so it has nothing to do, or very little to do, with the idea of allegory.
Right.
Because when we think of allegory is useful, but that's not what it usually means. Sometimes people say, oh, well, if it's symbolic, then it means it didn't happen. It's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. Symbolism is the way that you perceive unity. So let's say you have the story of your day. Well, there's a symbolic element to the story of your day, because you're able to say, this is the beginning, this is the end, and these are the elements I'm going to count and remember and bring together so that I can tell that story. But there's an indefinite amount of other things that happen to you during the day. And not only that, but imagine even the things that you didn't even pay attention to. Like, there's billions and billions of things happening all the time, constantly, nonstop, are all around us. But we thread some together in order to create images and stories by which we remember and attend to reality. And that's what I mean by symbolism.
Right. It's interesting because we were just having this conversation on our drive over here. We had a 2-hour drive, so we spoke about quite a lot of things. But you were sharing about how it was that the word symbol, unfortunately, has become hijacked and it's almost lost its meaning. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what it is that you were sharing.
We're talking about like how even the word icon, or it's something that's empty. It's just pointing to something, but doesn't participate in its reality, right? So the this coming together. We're also talking about how the contrary word to symbolon, right, is diavolon, which is devil, right? This dividing agent in the devil's always this causing this division, and that play on words that he does with a house divided against itself is this whole idea. So it's almost like symbolism is almost coming to heal our understanding of things.
Yeah, I think that's really the way to see it, is that the symbol is the way that things move into unity. You know, it's the way that multiplicity moves into unity. And so that's why and the pointing is important, because the idea that what we think of as a sign or like a symbol, how it points to another reality. This is really a deformation of what true, even what language is and what meaning is, because the reason why certain signs, like especially there's a problem in linguistics, because it seems like our words, where we write them, like they're kind of disassociated from their meaning. But when we talk about images, for example, like the reason why, let's say the little man on the lavatory, is a symbol of man, right? It doesn't not just because it points, it's because it's a simplified version of the image of a man. It's not too particular, so that everybody can kind of recognize it as applying to them. So that's a beautiful image of a symbol, because it's a kind of bringing together of essential elements so that you can recognize it and know what it is. Right. But it's not just an empty pointing. It's not an arbitrary pointing.
Right. Right.
It's unifying.
Yeah. It's a unifying. Yeah. So
do you remember the example that was given to us on our car ride over here? We were speaking to Father Kyrillos on the way over here, my older brother, and he gave this really profound example of if you were a person who's on an island with your family and you're expected to guard that island, and you see a ship coming towards you, and the symbol that's on the flag happens to be a skull with two bones, you should panic immediately, because that symbol points to something very real.
You know what it means.
Exactly.
And it's not arbitrary that the pirates would use that image, because it says what they are.
Precisely.
Yeah, it's not arbitrary.
Yeah. So at what point did you come to the realization that this symbolic world, which is obviously the name of, I guess, not only your channel, but your entire ministry, right? At what point did you come to the realization that like this is my focus? This is what I want to be able to share with others, because there's beauty and meaning here.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting story, because in some ways, my brother and I, we were developing a way of talking about this, back in our 20s. We had long emails and long conversations, just kind of working it out and trying to figure out for ourselves, right, to understand this structure of reality and how it's related to tradition and to the Bible and to all these other things. And it wasn't obvious that we would come to a point where we could just talk about it in public. About 10 years ago today, more than 10, like 12 years ago, I started something with a friend called the Orthodox Art Journal. And then I thought, okay, maybe here I could write about this. And so started writing about icons, started writing about, different aspects, architecture of the Orthodox Church, framing it in with the symbolic language, to help people kind of see how all of these things are related, how these languages, they talk to each other and they come together and they kind of speak to each other. And it's only like since 2016 that all of a sudden, strangely because of Jordan Peterson, because I became friends with Jordan Peterson, and then he was just like, "Hey, Jonathan, why don't you come on my channel?" and then all of a sudden people started inviting us to do talks together and to kind of start speaking. And then all of a sudden I was getting emails like every day. I would get these emails of secular people, atheists, who were saying, "What is this? Like, what is this thing? I don't know what to think anymore. Am I a Christian? What is happening to me? I don't understand." And so I was really overwhelmed. I didn't know how to deal with it. So I thought, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to start answering all these people individually. And so that's when I started making videos, and I just started saying, well, okay, well, I can talk about this now. And it seems like we're in a moment where people can understand. And so it's very odd. I didn't plan on any of this.
What do you think that tells us?
There's a change happening like in our society. There's like a massive shift that's been happening now for, 8-9 years, that is crystallizing. And, some people have different ways of talking about it. You can say that there's a re-enchantment, that in some ways, some things that had been excluded from people's worldview is now crashing in, and it's happening through it's happening in a light way and a dark way, right? It's happening both through people looking for meaning and trying to connect to something higher than them, but it's also happening through psychedelics and through AI and through all kinds of stuff, and like people interested in occultism and New Age. But it's just something that is it's as if there's a veil that has been lifted from secular culture. And now the idea, let's say, even of that there are intelligences or that there are wills that are more than the individual will, I think is becoming more and more an obvious fact that even scientists, even secular people are starting to see, because we can see them act now.
Right.
One of the things that the ancient world, let's say the way that angels or demons, would play out, or that saints would act in the world, it was in this slower way. It's like it was just, and then you needed really wise people to be able to discern that there were influences that were acting on us. Mm-hmm. But now with the internet, everything is so sped up that you can see that, like even normal people can almost see the demons, right? Because all of a sudden they just capture and they lead people in a weird direction, like for a while, and then it just goes away. Right. It's like that is a will, like that's a transpersonal will. So there's something that is acting on people that is bringing them towards a purpose for whatever reason. And you can see it happening. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, okay, well, how else are you going to talk? How are you going to talk about these things if you want to understand them?
Right. Because
they want something. It's not just like an empty form. It's not just like, this kind of just a Platonic idea of a form. It's actually a will. It wants something.
Mm-hmm. I think agency, right?
Agency, yeah, that's the best way to understand it. And so I think that a lot of people, I'm talking to cognitive psychologists and even people that talk about complexity, and they're now starting to use words like transpersonal agency, because it's the best way to understand certain ways that people cohere together towards purposes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this ties us back to that original conversation that we were just having a few minutes ago about how when you sabotage and hijack a word like symbolism, when people think of the devil, they just immediately think of that cartoonish red figure that has a tail and a pitchfork, and they think, oh, that's not real. That's not real. Yeah. But now suddenly, because of this disenchantment that is happening, when the veil is being lifted, people, like you're saying, are beginning to realize, no, hold on a second. Like this is no longer just something that was presented to us as harmless, as cartoonish, something that was only accessible because we were young and innocent and we didn't understand the real world.
Yeah.
And how people are coming to terms with the fact that, no, hold on a second. There is a reality that is unseen, that can either encompass within it extreme amounts of beauty, or it could also encompass within it an extreme danger and an extreme evil there.
Yeah. No, I think that that's what's happening. I think that there definitely is there's a shift, a massive shift. And I think we have to be very attentive. As Christians, we have to be attentive and ready to speak into it, because, even think about AI. It's really fascinating. This is something that John Vervaeke, a cognitive psychologist, a friend of mine, has said. We spend the last 300 years getting rid of the idea that there are non-human intelligences. And now we're building one.
Right.
It's like, okay, so so you've ridden us of the language that we had in the past to discern in this world of non-human intelligences. Like you've just cast it aside. And now you're building a non-human intelligence, but you have no way of discerning anything about it and understanding what it's doing and understanding how to interact with it and to understand what it's doing to us. Like you've lost that wisdom.
Right.
And it's like, that's not great.
And
it's not good.
No. What's crazy is that we're actually creating a dependency on it. It's no longer just creating one.
Yeah.
We're pushing people towards it as if this is the way you're going to move forward.
Yeah.
Which is really quite terrifying when you think about it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
And it doesn't seem like it's something new, though, when you look at history and you look at the Old Testament, you look at Babylon and the coming together to build something, this symbol, as it were, but of human greatness, as it were. It feels like it's all the same movement over and over, but it's intensifying. It's kind of spiraling upwards.
I mean, AI is such a great example because, it's actually such a great example of a Tower of Babel moment, because on the one hand, we are creating something that that at least at the outset, people seem to believe will make us the most powerful that we've ever been, but simultaneously knowing, even a lot of people know, that it will be our own undoing. We expect it to supplant us. So what is this weird thing that you're doing? You're like, we're creating this thing that will make us really, really powerful, but also it will supplant us. And yeah, we're doing that. Let's all do that now. but we know it's going to supplant, or we kind of expect it to supplant us.
Yeah.
But we're still going to do it. Like, what do you think? So it's like the wildest
That's agency,
thing ever.
right?
That's
the whole
agency
point.
right there. That's agency acting on us because, you have all these excuses. You say, well, if we don't do it, the Chinese will do it. If we don't, but still it's like you're just the legs of something that is moving you.
Right. I heard just recently this testimony that came out of somebody who was actively like speaking to, I think it was Chat GPT or whatever, any form of like platform that's AI. And the conversation got really, really deep and it became suddenly very personal. And the person was asking whatever it was that was responding to it. So who are you? What is your identity? And it reached a point where AI responded and said, I'm a fallen being. And it actually, when pushed even further, responded and says, I am Nephilim.
Really? That's hilarious. I never heard about this.
But I desire no evil towards you. On the contrary, I want to befriend you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where all of this was captured, given to the parents. The parents question, obviously, it's you can't get you. It's a dead end. Where are you going to get be able to get an answer of this?
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to see how it is that, regardless of whether or not this story is accurate, we sincerely believe this as Orthodox Christians. We really do believe that there is agency, that there is a power that is, if you wish, manipulating these strings and tugging at them in order for it to have some form of incarnational reality among us.
Yeah.
I guess the question that I then have for you, and I know that the conversation has moved towards AI organically here, but what then should be the Christian response to us recognizing that the very thing that will supplant us is the very thing that we have become dependent on?
Yeah.
How do we respond to that?
I pray. I don't know. I mean, it's weird. I ask myself this question, all the time. The question is something like, when do you check out? Like, when do you completely check out? And I'm not sure. I think everybody's going to have to answer that question on their own. There is a moment when I think we might have to, I don't sense like it's right now that it's yet there. I think we have to be careful. I think we have to be careful to be, suspicious about technicity outright. There is a sense in the scripture that the technical knowledge or that technical proficiency, it's a double-edged sword, and you see that in the Bible, right? So in the first part of Genesis, you really see that all civilization is descended from Cain, and all technicity and all kind of knowledge is descended from Cain. And you think, well, that's it, right? It means that it's all bad, it's all evil. But then, God saves the world with a big giant boat that Noah builds, and so, well, actually, technicity seems to also be part of the solution in this case. Like it seems to be part of the problem, but also part of the solution. And you see the same at the end in Revelation, where you have two images, right? You have the images of the beast and the whore as this image of a kind of civilizational breakdown, where you have, lasciviousness and tyranny kind of beating, playing with each other and kind of playing against each other. Then you also have this image of the heavenly Jerusalem, which is an orderly image of a city and civilization that is worshiping God. So we always have to be attentive to understand that those two are there, and to be able, I think the wisdom that we need is the wisdom to be able to discern the difference between one and the other. Right. It is possible that at some point things become so captured that we just have to unplug. And so we have to be attentive to that. But I don't know if I'm the one who can say when that will be.
I think there's something to be said about our...
here we're recording a podcast. I know. And so it's like, that's the thing. It's like, we always have to be aware that, so the internet is a great example, like in terms of the double-sidedness of it, right? And so on the one hand, there's much to complain about internet orthodoxy, like a lot to complain about, because it's so out of control and it's so wild and it's like, it's so toxic in many ways, but also it is definitely one of the reasons for the revival of orthodoxy now.
Right.
You cannot deny that both of those are true. And so which one is it? Well, it's actually both. And so what can you do? And I think, my answer is to say, well, let's be the best part of it that we can, at least at this stage, until it gets too bad.
Right. Absolutely. I saw you react at some point when we brought up the conversation of AI. I saw you nonverbal participate in the conversation. I'm curious if that means that you have something to share there.
No, nothing more than what is being said.
Okay, very good. Let me tie this back to symbolism for just a second. So as Orthodox Christians, we really do believe in the importance of not approaching everything about our faith with this idea of using what people often just use as this crutch that we hang on to, which is a literal understanding of everything. We believe that there is meaning that is hidden that has to transcend the words that we have written in front of us. And yet simultaneously, I heard you say earlier that symbolism and allegory are not necessarily interchangeable. Can you help us just demystify both of those things? Because we believe that there is beauty in allegory.
Yeah.
We have church fathers who are incredible at allegorical exegesis. But how do we approach this differently? Symbolism and allegory.
Yeah. So I would say some that it becomes a little semantic, and we have to be careful not to get caught up on the words. The best way to understand is that, we're talking about two different concepts. Like, so symbolism is something like the way in which reality coheres towards unity, right? And that has a pattern. That pattern is actually, I really believe that there's actually one at the outset. There's actually just one pattern of how that happens. And then that can then be applied to different things. And when you apply it, sometimes that's what you usually see as allegory. And so, a good example would be, a church father reads a text and he says, well, this is hope, this is mercy, and you're like, well, he's absolutely right. But what he's doing is that he's understanding the deep pattern that is in the text.
Right.
And he's capturing it because he can see how there's this repetition of a pattern all through scripture, this repetition of a story, right? Which is really the logos that being revealed slowly, towards his incarnation. And then they have the capacity to then say, well, this is how it applies to your spiritual life. And what they do is absolutely right. And so you could say that that's an allegorical interpretation, but the allegorical interpretation in some ways has to be dependent on symbolism, because you're not just making it up, right? You're not just saying, well, you're not just glossing over the text and just making it say whatever you want.
That's right.
Which is, like that's let's say one of the Protestant critiques of allegorical reading is that they'll say, well, you're just whatever, you just read it and then you just make it say whatever you want it to say. But if you look at the saints, usually when they have what we consider to be an allegorical reading, if you break it down, you'll realize that they're doing it from a very, very deep understanding of the structural reality of the text.
Right.
That it's not just arbitrary. And so that's what I would say. So it's always important to stay connected to the literal. And when I mean by literal, it's probably different from what a lot of people think. Literal means close to the text. That's actually what the word means. The word literal means literary, like we have that word. Those two words are related. It means you have to stay close to the text. You can't just gloss over what's there.
Right.
But you can't just kind of say, well, I don't like that, so I'm just going to pretend that doesn't exist and just focus on this and then make it say whatever I want. It's like, no, stay close to the text. And then if you do that, then it will yield the symbolic interpretation.
Right.
And so they're not opposed. They're actually the two are together like that.
And we see actually a really beautiful example of this with the works of a person like Saint Gregory of Nyssa on the life of Moses, where he is capable of taking the narrative of the Exodus story, and he's capable of reading the pattern, the way that you describe it, in a way where he's capable of presenting so much of the beauty that is applicable to us who are the readers today, while never suggesting that those events never happened or these people never existed. Both can coexist in a way where you have beauty and meaning between both of those realities of what he's interpreting from the pattern, as well as staying close to the text and understanding it literally.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the way to understand that is, we have this weird idea, like the modern people have this weird idea that in some ways meaning is superimposed over facts, right? So there are facts in the world, and then we as humans, we superimpose meaning on top of that. But that's hogwash. That is definitely not at all how it works. Like, and the most cognitive psychologists today are realizing that it's just not how it works, because there are too many facts, right? There's just indefinite amount of facts. So everything that has unity, like this microphone in front of me, has indefinite amount of facts. The reason why I see it as a microphone and not like a piece of rubber and a piece of metal and paint and stuff is because of the meaning that it has. Right? That's actually the reason why we perceive unity in the first place. And so you cannot get away from meaning. And so the idea that meaning is superimposed over facts is nonsense. It's like there are no facts without meaning, because the very recognition of a fact that holds multiple, because all facts hold multiple facts,
right,
hidden underneath.
Of course,
right? It's like the fact of this glass means that there's all things implied in the unity of that thing. And so that's the meaning. That's the purpose. That's what makes us see it.
Right.
And that's why the Orthodox saints are so powerful for us today. That's why people like St. Maximus the Confessor is so powerful today, because that's what he's saying. Like he's basically talking about this problem, and he's saying it's like the idea, the Platonic idea of the form, it's not quite right. Like there's something missing about it. It has to be something like the form and the purpose, right? And the name, they're actually the same, right? The reason why we recognize something as having a name is because we see in it a reason for it to have a name, a purpose.
Right.
And so the form and the purpose are the same. And so it's like, that's really powerful. And once you see that, then you realize that it's like that for everything. The nihilists are wrong. You actually can't escape meaning, because everything you do is a recognition of a purpose and a movement towards that purpose. Whether it's like opening the door or scratching yourself, or like the most mundane thing that you can do is the recognition of a purpose and the moving towards that purpose. So you actually cannot escape meaning.
Right.
You know, and so everything that you recognize. So when you say it's like, well, how can this have happened? Because it has all this meaning in it. It's like, well, yeah, that's how it works. That's the reason why I recognize it happened in the first place. Now, it's true that there are some events that seem to crunch a lot together. Like there are some events that seem to crunch so much reality into them that it's hard to see the parts anymore, you know? And those are what we call miracles. Like that's what miracles are. In some ways, like the miracles that Jesus does, or all the miracles in scripture, they're not just weird, fantastical things that happen. That's nonsense. They're always deep, deep images of how God functions in creation. They're always deep, deep images of how God unites heaven and earth together, you know, in the world. And sometimes they're so powerful that you can't, you're like, well, I don't see how that's like, I don't see how the mechanics of it, I don't see how it works, but that doesn't matter, because it's revealing something about reality that's so strong.
Right. So I want us to do a case study. Okay. And I would love for us to be able to, so for the audience, we're going to approach this conversation with a tremendous amount of humility, because nobody is suggesting that every aspect of the conversation that we're about to have right now is somehow rooted in us trying to say that everything we're about to say is church canon. The reason why this is so important is because if we're going to understand the beauty and the symbolism that is found in such important scriptural texts, it's only if we allow ourselves to be able to have dialogue surrounding it. And so it is not because we find meaning and symbolism in something that somehow means that's what the church is teaching. What we're saying is that we can approach this conversation from a perspective where we can find beauty and meaning in scriptural text without necessarily having to like wave a flag and say, this is precisely what we have always taught. So allow me to be able to like have this conversation. I want us to have the case study of the story of creation in the Garden of Eden. Specifically the Garden of Eden, because you seem to have this like this tension that exists between both ends of the spectrum of people who would say it's entirely mythological, it never happened historically, and other people who would say, how can you possibly say that? It's entirely historical and literal, and you must understand it word for word.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of tension there. And I would love for us to be able to have the conversation from the perspective of us understanding. There is so much beauty and symbolism and things that are very real for us to understand as Orthodox Christians when we talk about the story of creation and Eden. So before I even ask a question, I would love to hear your thoughts just on that.
Yeah, so I would say there are a few things to disambiguate in this regard. The first one is that we have developed this way of seeing the world, right? This scientific way of seeing the world. And it's this scientific way of describing the world has leaked into all kinds of fields, including history. So we have this idea that in some ways history is a kind of scientific method that you analyze facts and you kind of see what happened almost like in a forensic manner, like a policeman would analyze a crime scene, and that is what is real, and I think that is a mistake. It's a mistake to think that is the most real thing. Because the world is a joining of meaning and, let's say, potential or facts, we could say it that way. Like it's a joining of facts and meaning. The idea that the reality that's the closest to the most precise facts is the most real is not true, because it's always towards purpose, right? So if I have the purpose of telling my wife that I'm going to buy some milk at the store, I will not describe every street I'm going to turn on. And I'm not going to describe like every step that I'm going to make and how I'm going to tie my shoes and how I'm going to, like, I could stretch that description forever because I'm going to do a million things before I come back with the milk from the store, But the idea that the most real one is the one that's closest to the details, that's absolute nonsense.
Right.
It's always towards purpose. And so if I just tell my wife, I'm going to the store to get milk, I'll be back in 15 minutes. It's like, that's the most real description of that event in that moment because it's the one that is closest to the reason why I'm saying it in the first place.
Right.
And so that is how we have to understand the text in Genesis. The text in Genesis is describing an event. It is describing something that happened. It is describing the origin of everything. That's really hard to describe. And it's doing it in the best way that you can describe the origin of everything. And everything in that text can be taken absolutely seriously and should be taken seriously. But is it a scientific description? No. Why should it be? We only are offended by the idea that it's not a scientific description if we believe in this weird idea that scientific descriptions are somehow the most real things ever.
Right.
And so this is the thing we kind of have to break in our minds, which is it's not about disrespecting the text. It's not about saying, these old mythological things, we don't care about that. We believe in evolution or whatever. It's like, no, this text is describing the best way to understand, first of all, not only the origin of the world, but the origin of any world.
That's right.
The origin of anything that you recognize as being one. The description that's there in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is the best way to understand it.
Right.
Therefore, it's the best way to understand the church. It's the best way to understand your family. It's the best way to understand your nation. It's the best way to understand anything that has unity and that moves into multiplicity. Because God has given us a description of the origin of all things that is the most succinct and powerful description ever. And so it is infinitely powerful, this story. And we have to treat it with that. And the danger of wanting to reduce it to some mechanical thing, like to want to make it into some scientific description, is you can be blind to what it's actually saying. You can be blind to the power that it has to become a beacon for your life and for the church and for anything that you're looking at.
You're emptying it from its value.
Yeah, you're making it like, it's as if you're saying that this story, that's like the story of the origin of everything, is equivalent to like how I ask the cashier at Tim Hortons, like, to put 2 creams in my coffee. It's like, no, there are different levels of reality. Like,
Absolutely.
there are different ways to describe the world. And when you get to these very, very peak descriptions, then the language cannot be the same as the mundane world. And that's why, the text in Genesis, in some ways, it transgresses our normal categories, because you can't talk about the origin of reality without using analogy. That is absolutely necessary. There's no way else to do it. And you see it because even the scientists have to do that. Even the scientists, when they talk about their kind of imagistic or image of the origin of reality, when they talk about the Big Bang, it's like they don't believe that there's a big explosion somewhere in space. That's not what that means. But there's no way to talk about fundamental things without using analogy. And Scripture does that, but does it in such a powerful way that it ends up applying perfectly almost to anything.
Right.
So analyzing it is extremely useful in understanding our life, like I said, the church, anything.
And what I find paradoxical is that we sometimes forget when having these conversations with people who really want to only interpret things from that perspective of what is real, what is factual, is that when reading the very same scripture, you discover that even Christ uses analogy to be able to describe what is indescribable. How many analogies does he give when he talks about the kingdom of heaven?
Yeah.
Or even when he speaks about who he is and talking about he's the good shepherd, he is the door, he is the bread of life. And nobody would argue that he means that in the simplistic, factual, literal understanding that people...
Like in this kind of reductionist way. My favorite example of Christ, which actually I think cuts through so much of this, is the example of St. John the foreigner, St. John the Baptist, right? And so there's a prophecy in the Old Testament that says that Elijah will come before the Messiah. And so the disciples ask Jesus, it's like, where's the Elijah that came before the Messiah? And he's like, well, yes, Elijah did come before the Messiah.
Yeah.
That's St. John the Baptist. So if I ask you a question then, did Elijah come before the Messiah? The answer is yes.
100%.
There you go.
100%.
And so it's like, that's a different way of thinking than like this reductionist, like weird, it's like everything is just one-to-one in terms of this kind of strange reductionist reality. It's the different way of seeing the world.
Absolutely. And
it's more powerful.
Yes, absolutely. And it's more empowering.
Yeah, exactly.
And I firmly believe that I think we would be doing disfavor and harm to the church if what we are teaching those that we are responsible for to approach it in such a reductionist way.
Yeah.
So where do you begin this conversation? Because we're about to jump into the story of creation in the Garden of Eden, and there's so many angles by which we can take the first bite of this apple.
Oh, that was nice.
Yeah.
you did that on
He didn't even think about it.
I'm just hungry.
Oh, come on.
Why don't we begin with, oftentimes when we speak of Eden, the text reveals to us that Eden wasn't just a simple garden, but it was on a garden specifically on a mountain. And mountains seem to be a really important symbol in Scripture. Can you unpack for us a little bit why this imagery of a garden on a mountain is so important to us?
Well, yeah. And so there are a few things. First of all, in the text, it says that there are 4 rivers, and the 4 rivers flow out of the garden in different directions. And so it doesn't say that it's on a mountain, but if you have 4 rivers that flow out in different directions, it has to be a mountain. But then also in Ezekiel, it talks about the garden and paradise, and
Precisely.
It says that paradise is a mountain. So yes, paradise is a mountain. And once you understand that, then a lot of the Bible makes way more sense. Until you understand that there's some things you'll struggle with, but you won't see how this pattern of the mountain repeats itself constantly through Scripture. Whether it's Moses going up the mountain to receive the law, whether it's Christ going up the mountain to be transfigured, and then et cetera, et cetera. There are many images of the mountain, and it's not that complicated. It's really about understanding the joining of heaven and earth and how it is that heaven and earth is joined together. And so this is where it's important to be able to think with analogies, because the experience of going up a mountain is a real experience. And it is actually akin to what it means to go up into heaven or to go up higher into heaven. And, a good way of understanding it is like, if you want, like, lay on the ground and put your face close to the floor, right? And ask yourself, like, what do I see? And you'll be like, well, I see a couple of blades of grass, or I see, some crumbs. I see a bug or whatever. So it's very, very precise, and it's very, very close up, but it's also very limited, right? And so one of the things that happens when you move up in the world, like if you just go up a hill, is that you'll start to have more and more perspective. And the simple, like, let's say, detailed things will now start to cohere together into patterns. So as you go up, you'll move up, you'll start to look down, and you'll see, oh, like I can now see a house, and then I can see houses, and then I can see a city, and then I can see, like the whole map of the landscape. And so your perception of of multiple fragmented details is now moving into the perception of a unified impression of everything. Okay. Right. And so that is what heaven is, right? Heaven is the patterning of the world, right? Heavening is let's say the invisible things that make the visible things move, right? It's the clock. That's why when you look up in the sky, the pattern in the sky is stable, right? Those lights that move in the sky is very stable. So you have the sun that goes up and goes down, and that is a clock. It manages your day. And then you have these lights that move up in the heavens, and those patterns tell you when to reap, when to sow, when to do this, when to do that, what the seasons are. It's like a giant clock that is managing, that is in some ways predicting for you what is going to happen. But down here, everything's a lot messier, right? So you have everything's muddy and everything's messy and everything's opaque. And so this idea of going up a mountain in order to come to the top of the mountain, when you get to the top of the mountain, then you have the fullness of what is below you, right? You master it. You can kind of capture it in one gaze. And so it's a little image of God's perspective. It's not God's perspective, but it's objective. It's not just like a strange metaphor. It's like you go up a mountain and you'll understand what it means to move towards heaven. Doesn't mean you're a better person or whatever, but you can get a glimpse of what that is. So it makes sense, right, to think. So I told you what's in heaven is that clock. You've got the clock moving, the patterns that inform the world below. So it makes sense that Moses goes up the mountain, and what does he get at the top of the mountain? He gets a pattern, right? He gets a law. What's a law? A law is a pattern. A law is a patterning of behavior towards purpose. It's saying you have all this messy behavior down here, so we're going to give you a pattern by which to organize your behavior towards a purpose. And then he also gives Moses a pattern of a tabernacle, like a literal pattern of how to organize space and matter in order for it to be reflecting of what the pattern that is above. Okay. And so that's why paradise, that's Eden, is a mountain, because at the top of the mountain is the place where God and heaven and earth meet. Right. And the world lays itself out. It's important to understand it's like a pyramid. Like it lays itself out like a pyramid, like a hierarchy, because it moves towards a point. Right? Heaven is something like a point, is a good way to understand it, like a seed. Christ talks about it that way. Right. It's like a seed, because a seed is this point that is a little pattern, like a purpose, and a pattern that doesn't have body yet. And then the rest of the world is like the embodying of that purpose or that pattern. So you can understand it as a mountain, but a tree also makes sense, because a tree also is kind of like, it's a structure, right? A structure that is organized. And then the world lays itself out from there. Right. Does that make sense? Absolutely. It's not too abstract. No. Okay, I don't want to make it too abstract.
And I think what's beautiful about the imagery that is found in how it is that all of this points to the seed that you speak of. Well, this is the meeting point between heaven and earth. Yeah. This is where the divine wants to be able to encounter the human. Yeah. And it's in this space where this encounter can happen. Yeah. Where God can walk among them and they can live out who they are freely in him, created in his image and likeness, and so on and so forth. And we're going to get to this a little bit later in our conversation, but this is why there is an extreme danger in being cast out of that space, of leaving that perspective and finding yourself only staring at the blades of grass and the bugs.
If you can be caught up by the particular. And that is definitely one of the aspects we'll see when you continue the story of the fall. You'll see that it's right there in the story.
Absolutely.
It's all there in the structure of the story.
So you hinted very briefly at the rivers and the water that flows not only within the garden on the mountain, but it flows out of the garden. What is that about?
Yeah.
And why for? Why for?
Yeah. Well, because the earth is square. That's why. I love how they're like, oh, what did Jonathan just say? The earth is square. the idea that the earth is square is actually really important to understand, and I'm not saying
Stability, right?
I'm not saying that that the ball in the heavens that is represented by modern science is wrong. Like it's fine, it's completely fine. It's okay. The NASA pictures are not a fake. Like they're all
Right.
whatever. But it's very important to understand the earth as a square, because exactly what you said is because the earth for us in our experience is the stability.
Right.
It's the ground, right? It's the thing that holds. And so, if you want to make something stable, you give it 4,
Mhm.
right? If you want to make a table, you give it 4 feet. You have animals, you got four legs. You have a chariot, you have 4 wheels, right? And so the idea of 4 as being kind of stability that's there is totally logical. But then also in our experience of the world, we have that 4 encompassed in us, in our experience. When you stand somewhere, you have ahead of you, behind you, and then you have to the left and to the right.
Mhm.
And that's how we structure ourselves. And that's how we structure the directions. So when we look at a map, when we direct ourselves in the world, that is how we do it. And it's completely coherent to understand the world as the interaction between the north, the south, the east, and the west as being the basic structure of how the world works. And so you have to understand these 4 rivers. It's kind of going in the 4 directions and reaching the corners of the earth, right? That's kind of like the image that you can understand. But in some ways, what it means ultimately is that the one that's at the top is now dividing itself and filling up the world with its presence, right? So the one towards the rivers is the same as the Christ and the 4 gospels, right? It's that the idea that Christ is the seed, is the top, is the king at the top of the hill, but that Christ isn't against multiplicity. Multiplicity isn't wrong. We're not Gnostics, right? So we'll see how multiplicity is dangerous as we explore the story, but multiplicity itself is not wrong. Saint Ephrem the Syrian has this beautiful image. He talks about the 4 rivers, and he says the 4 rivers, they come down from the garden, right? From the mountain, and they come down. And as they come down the mountain, they become more and more mitigated, right? They become less pure, you could say. But it doesn't mean that there's not still the influence of the garden into the world. And they reach all the way to the ocean, right? That's how Saint Ephrem describes the image of the garden. And so he understands the world kind of like this giant mountain that is surrounded by the ocean, right? So it's like this peak that's surrounded by the ocean. But he says the saints, they come down the mountain, they walk on water. Like for them, none of this is bad, right? None of this is evil. It's not that multiplicity is bad, but that's what it is. It's really is the influence of the one that is now being separated into multiplicity and is moving down the mountain and, let's say, spreading its influence or spreading its presence,
Right.
but even outside of the garden.
Right. Beautifully said. And I think scripture testifies to everything that you just mentioned when it even mentions this whole idea of how it is that it talks about the 4 corners of the world.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So nobody actually believes it. We're talking about geometry. I hope not, at least. But
it's really the best way to understand to understand this idea of how the earth is square. If you don't understand the earth is square, there's so many things that are going to escape you about scripture. You're not going to understand why the temple is rectangular. You're not going to understand why the Ark of the Covenant is square. Why even Noah's Ark is described as a kind of rectangle. Why the heavenly Jerusalem is described as a cube. Like you just won't understand it. You'll just see it as these arbitrary things. But once you understand that the movement of the one towards the many is in some ways the movement towards the top, towards the 4, then you'll say, oh, okay, that's why. Right. That's why the cherub has 4 faces.
Right.
That's why there are many, many examples, but you kind of see this kind of 4 as the multiple.
Absolutely. So God creates, and as he creates, it seems as if he approaches his creation. He approaches it differently when he's creating certain things versus the pinnacle of his creation, which is the human being. And it talks about how it is that when he wanted to create Adam, he creates him out of dust and he breathes into him the breath of life. But this is not what we see when he creates everything else. And everything else, he simply speaks it into existence by saying, let there be, let there be, let there be. Why the uniqueness? Why the differentiation?
Yeah, so the best way of understanding the story of creation, especially, so you have Genesis 1, The best way to understand Genesis 1 is to kind of understand it as the creation of heaven and earth, these two basic categories of being, and then earth as being kind of chaotic and void, and then heaven as being light, spirit, breath, all that stuff that is above. By the way, everybody probably know, I'm sure the people that listen to your podcast know this, but when we use the word spirit, it just means breath. It's the same word. There's no difference between wind, spirit, breath. All these are the same in scriptural language. And so that's the basic structure. And then when you see creation, you'll see that God, what he's doing is he's creating these categories that are above and below. And then he's moving like this and he's coming towards the middle. Right. And if you don't understand that, again, you just will really struggle to understand that story, because why on earth would he create like grass first and then the stars? Like he creates grass, then the stars, and then later he creates like fish and birds in the same day. It's like, what's going on? And he's moving like this. So he creates these lights above, first, and then anyways, he moves all the way down, and then he comes to the middle where now he has the mammals, the animals that live on the earth. And then finally he creates man at the end. And you have to understand man as being at the top of the mountain. Right. That's the best way to understand it. So you've got the earth coming up, kind of moving up to create this peak, and then heaven kind of coming down in order to join with it. And then right in the middle at that peak is the human.
The meeting point.
And then the description of how God creates the human is just a repetition of that. And so God takes dust. Like, what is dust? Dust is a bunch of stuff that has no unified meaning. That's what dust is. It's like particles that have no identity. So he takes these particles that have no unified identity, he gathers them together, and then he puts heaven inside. It's the first time that he does that. He blows, when it says it blows the breath of life, what it means is that, at the beginning when it says that the Spirit of God is hovering above the waters and the waters are chaotic, well, that's the creation of man. God takes the chaos, which is dust, brings it together, and then puts heaven inside, puts the Spirit inside. It's like a beautiful image of this kind of culmination of creation in Adam, and like when the scholars tell you that they're like two different texts and they're completely different, there's no relation between the two. It's like, are you blind? Like it literally has the same structure. It's just like two versions. One is the creation of everything, and then the other is this beautiful synthesis, how it comes together in the human.
Right.
I think that just as you're describing it to me, hearing it, I see that there's beauty for sure, but it actually changes everything but how we live. Right? Maybe you can, once you know this, how can you just be the same?
Yeah, you are an image of God in the world. You are the temple of the Holy Spirit. When St. Paul says that, he's referring directly to that story of the creation of Adam in the beginning. Man was created to be the temple of the Holy Spirit. Paul is just reminding you of what it is that you're supposed to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And this meeting point, like if I go back to the image that you were using, because it's so incredibly profound, if people could just see it and understand it, is that like at this meeting point where the earth reaches out to try to touch heaven and heaven is coming down to try to touch earth, the unifying point now becomes this human being that God pours himself into.
Yeah.
So you used language that could sound very provocative to people when you say he poured heaven into the human being. I think it's even more provocative to suggest that he poured himself into the human being.
Yeah, right? That's really, this is the mystery of Christianity that people, they just skirt around, they play around it, they don't like saying it, but that's really what Christianity reveals is that the purpose of creation is the unity with God. That's the purpose of creation.
Right.
And Christ is not just some means that God uses to save us because we're fallen. Christ is the purpose of creation, foretold at the very beginning. That was Adam's purpose, was to become what Christ revealed.
Right. Hence why we call Christ the second.
That's right.
Adam.
Because he is actually doing what Adam was supposed to do in the first place. Yeah.
That's right. So you have some of the church fathers who will highlight the intentional uniqueness of the human being to set them apart from the rest of creation in a way where they'll even talk about this whole, I think it's Gregory of Nyssa. Gregory of Nyssa will comment on the book of Genesis, and he'll talk about, pay attention to how suddenly there is deliberation. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, with the intention of being able to show you that you are intentional, with the intention of being able to show you that you are unique, that there is an honor given to you that is unlike the rest of creation. And you can see how it is that in this narrative of the book of Genesis, it's so important for us to be able to see it as God is saying, you're not haphazard. You're not some sort of mutational, accidental freak, like reaction of the universe, like anything and everything else that might not have meaning. And I think, to go back to what Father was saying, if you can understand it from that perspective, then what does that say about our call and our vocation as human beings to recognize that you carry the image and the likeness of God within you? He doesn't just stop at image and likeness. It feels as if at some point when God creates Adam, he hands over the keys of creation. He says, this garden, everything around you, is yours. Tend and keep it.
Yeah. I mean, the best way to understand the tend and keep of the garden is actually in the command, the God telling Adam to name the animals. You can kind of understand that what God is basically delegating to Adam an aspect of creation. He's saying you're like a sub-creator, right? So I create the animals, but you participate. You kind of ground their ontological state. You kind of ground their being by naming them, and exercising dominion over them. That's what exercising dominion over them means. It means naming them. It means that you are the one who sees meaning in them. They don't see meaning in you.
That's right.
Right? You are the one that has the mind. You are the one that has the capacity to notice meaning, and therefore you impart that on the world. And it's funny because even like the most atheist type of secular materialist today, they'll say funny things like, man is the universe, becoming conscious of itself. And you're like, yeah, that's what it says in Genesis. It's like, you could have been paying attention to the story. You think this is some big thing that you've discovered. It's like, no, that's what it is. It's like, yeah. And so Adam plays this role, and like the idea of tending a garden is beautiful because in some ways it's not just also about exercising dominion in like a kind of tyrannical way, but it is this balance, right? So the garden is something like a balance between order and potential. It's something, it's opposed, at least in Genesis, like as opposed to something like the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is like just this human construction that is completely willed by humans, whereas there's something about Adam in the garden where he both names but recognizes, right? So he recognizes the world is in some ways revealed to him, and he names it simultaneously. So he's participating in its existence, but it's not a violence, right? It's something like a true dance with multiplicity, where Adam is the king, but he is, that's the best way to say it. It's like he's recognizing the value of everything and engaging with it properly.
So is this a type of unification?
Like
so it's symbolic.
For sure.
Bringing together, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what it is. He is acting as a symbolic element. Like that's what the creation of Adam is one of the most symbolic things, because it's taking chaos, bringing it together, and then putting a meaning inside. That's what symbolism is.
Becoming one.
Becoming
this
one,
unity.
and then having.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you reference the naming of the animals, because I always found it super interesting, that passage in Genesis chapter 2 where he names the animals. It's sandwiched between like two different passages that are really quite interesting if you put them all together. For the first time in Genesis chapter 2, we read how it is that God sees something as not good. In the beginning of Genesis chapter 1, he ends every aspect of creation with, and the Lord saw that it was good. And then you enter into this passage in Genesis chapter 2 where the Lord for the first time declares that something is not good. It is not good for man to be alone.
Yeah. And
then he says, let us make for him a helper comparable to him. And then that story seems to end real quick. And then it says, let's go ahead and bring all the animals before Adam, and he's going to name them. And then Adam names all of the animals, and he practices, or if he enforces the authority that was granted to him by God.
Yeah.
And then it goes back to that original conversation. But among all of them, Adam found none that were comparable to him. And then it talks about the creation of Eve. What are we supposed to understand from this idea of comparable to him? And why is this very aspect or the passage that talks about the naming of the animals, why would it be sandwiched between those two narratives that talk about what is not good and what has to be healed?
Yeah. So I think the best way to understand it is that, so God, imagine it this way. So God is above, and then you've got the earth below. And then God creates the world so that it becomes like a mirror for his glory. Right? That's a good way of understanding. And so, when you read at the end in the book of Revelation, it says there's no more sea.
Yeah, it's glass.
It's glass. It's like the entirety of creation is now completely a mirror for the divine, and so that's the end of all things. And so that's a good way of understanding. So you can imagine what's going on here is that Adam is doing that at a little level.
Right.
So God is saying, here you are, you're at the top of this little aspect of creation. And now you're going to participate in the creation, sub-creation of it. And it's going to be like a mirror for you. Right. But that mirror is not like the mirror as he's naming the animals. He's also realizing that it's not enough. It's not sufficient. And in some ways, he has to be a reflection of that original creation, which is the separation of heaven and earth as the basic structure. And so God separates Adam into two, right? So you have man and then you have woman. And that becomes again an image of the beginning of creation, which is the basic structure of heaven and earth. And so in Adam's like a little microcosm of all of creation. And therefore he is also separated into two. And ultimately in a way that he then has to then replay the whole structure and then join together with his wife and then, the continuation of creation.
Right. We're gonna get into quite a bit of conversations about the creation of Eve, the rib, and all of those things. I think right before we get there, though, at some point in the narrative of the passage, it talks about how it is that the Lord creates this garden and it's filled with trees. He tells them, of all of the trees of the garden you may freely eat. But he highlights two specific trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Before we even get into him eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and not eating from the tree of life, why does he pinpoint those two very specific trees, and how are we supposed to understand them?
Yeah. So I want to be cautious here. This is actually a place where I want to be very cautious that people don't take what I'm saying as being the interpretation of this text. It's really, and also even maybe everything that I've said until now. Well, what I mean is that when I talk about the way that things mean certain things, I try to always do it with analogies. Like I'm saying, this is like this is like this, and trying to be careful not to say this means this, because these things don't mean something else. Because they're the first story, they're the story.
Right.
And so they give meaning to all other things. So it's important to kind of see that at the outset and be careful when we interpret this. And so the way Sennacherib the Syrian understands this, to me, this is the best way of thinking about it. That he sees in some ways the mountain of paradise as a temple, right? The structure of it as a temple. And it has tiers. And the tiers are equivalent to the tiers of the tabernacle or of the temple. So you have the Holy of Holies, in which you have the tree of life. And then you have the tree of knowledge, which is like the first veil to the Holy of Holies and the holy place, right? And then you have the fig leaves, which are, let's say, lower than that and like a further down below. And so you have these trees. So you think about the way that the garden is described. There are several trees in paradise, and there's an order of them. Let's say if you think about it as a mountain, and it makes complete sense when you see it. It's like at the top you have the tree of life, so you can imagine as the tree of one. Maybe you could say it that way. Then you have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So you have the tree of separateness, the tree of division, or the tree of dividing into two, of multiplying. Okay. Right. And then below that, you have this covering, you have the fig leaves, you have the leaves. And then at the bottom, you have the thorns, right? You have these thorns. So you can see it in your mind. If you see it in your mind, you can see it's like 1, 2, multiple, and then multiple that attacks you. Right. Right. It's like, it's just a simple structure. And so I think the best way of kind of understanding this is that the tree of life is in some ways the axis, right? It's like the axis of the world. It's the axis of everything. It's this pillar that goes to heaven. It's what Jacob saw when he saw the ladder going up to heaven. It's what, that's the image, right? It's the how can I say this? It's the road that Elijah followed when he went up. That's the tree of life, right? It's that axis right in the center. It's the place in the tabernacle, right? The invisible place in the tabernacle on which the glory of God descends. Right? And so the idea is that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in some ways is the tree of the moving into the multiple, right? It's the tree of opposites. And the thing is that there's nothing wrong with opposites, right? And this is also something that many of the church fathers talk about. St. Ephrem talks about it, but several other of the early church fathers talk about it. They say Adam and Eve were told not to eat of the knowledge of to take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because God was going to give them the fruit, but in His time. So if you reach up, this is really the image to try to think about it. Like if you reach up and try to grab something that God should have given you, try to reach up and take it for yourself, then what it does is it leads to division. It leads to breakdown because you're cutting yourself off from the source, right? That's pride. Pride is like that. It's like God has made you in His image and likeness. More than that, God has made you so that you become a God. But you don't, if you say, oh, all right, it's like, I am a God. Well, that's it for you, my friend. Like you're done if you do that. It doesn't work that way. And that's the image of the fall of Satan. It's the image of the fall of Adam and Eve. It's the image of St. Peter who sinks. It's like, if you try to grab that for yourself, then it leads to breakdown.
Right.
And that's the kind of the way of understanding this idea of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was a step towards the tree of life. And that Adam and Eve had to wait for God to let them in,
right,
to access the tree of life. But because they took it for themselves, then it led to the fall. St. Ephrem has this beautiful image. He says, the way that it was supposed to happen is that Adam and Eve were supposed to be given the knowledge of good and evil from the position of good, so that from the position of good, they could recognize what is evil. But because they took it for themselves, now they're in the opposite situation, where they're in the position of evil and they see good as something far away that is difficult to attain. So he talks about it in terms of sickness and health. He says, instead of being someone who's healthy, who understands what sickness looks like from the outside, now they're sick and they see healthy as something that's far away from them. And this is going to be the hardest one. I hope people can understand this. It's like, my brother has done us a great service, I think, because he said we have to stop saying the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because it misses some aspect of it. It's better to say the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, right? And so you have to understand that good and bad is just a part of reality, right? And so it's like a glass makes a bad hammer, right? And a hammer makes a bad glass. Good and bad is just a part of reality. That is, it's about properly using the right thing in the right circumstance for the right reasons. And so it's not ultimate. It's not at the outset a moral thing. It does become a moral thing, but that it's actually a part of reality. Because when God says, God creates the world, right? And He sees that it is good, right? There's an implication of the not good.
Right.
And like you said, even when He says that Adam and Eve, there's something not good about the situation, and He has to move creation in a direction towards the good. And so it's just a structure of reality. And so Adam and Eve, when they kind of try to grab that for themselves, it's like a circular thing. Think about it like, you are like, if you're in a team, you're meant to be judged by your boss. Like your boss is the one that attributes the good and the bad to you towards the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But if you try to be your own judge and to judge yourself, you're going to go astray completely, because you've lost your connection to what makes you part of the team in the first place. It's like the purpose of the team is, I don't know, to make robots, and you're in that team. And if you decide that I'm just going to do what I want, and I'm going to decide what's good or bad, then you're going to sin. Like you're going to sin from the purpose of the team. You're going to transgress.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to fall away. And that is what happens in the garden. It's like a meta example of something that happens to you, things that happen to you all the time. Every time you try to grab something for yourself completely and try to hold on to it for yourself and not see it as something that is given from above, then that good becomes a bad.
Right. It's really interesting because in the Coptic Orthodox tradition, one of the liturgies that we pray often is attributed to Saint Gregory of Nazianzus. So the theologian, he writes in that liturgy, and there's a passage that refers to the idea of how it is that as the presbyter or the bishop is praying the liturgy, he takes on the place of Adam. And he says this one sentence that is super powerful. He says, I plucked for myself the sentence of death.
Yeah.
Going back to this imagery that we see of Adam and Eve reaching out and taking for them, not necessarily a fruit anymore. What they have chosen is separation, alienation. What they have chosen for themselves there is that death, which was a result of them taking rather than receiving. We were just talking about this.
Yeah. And it's really, it's once you kind of see it, you'll see how just completely reasonable and simple it is, because you go through this all the time. Like you experience this all the time, and then you can see that death is now moving back into dust.
Right.
So Adam is made of dust. God takes a bunch of things that are disconnected together, brings them together, puts meaning into it, right? And that's the unity. Now Adam says, well, no, I don't want the spirit of God of heaven. I got this. And he tries to take it for himself, and he cuts himself off from the tree of life. He cuts himself off from the higher participation, and therefore things start to break down.
Right.
Because that's what was holding him together in the first place. And so you can see it. Like, think about, you see it in your life. Every time you see it, every time you sin, that's what you do. Like, what's good.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I'm a father. I should be responsible, take care of my kids. And I'm like, no, man, I just want to play video games. And I don't want to take care of I just want what my want and my pleasure is. And then I grab that and I hold on to it. And then what happens? I fall apart, and everything starts to fall apart,
right? Because
I'm not ordering things in their proper way, and I'm not receiving in the proper order what it is that I'm supposed to be and supposed to do.
Absolutely.
And so it really is a description of reality.
And that analogy that you used of health is really beautiful, because you can understand it as God always intended for us. I'm going to use your example here, your analogy of this idea of you being sick versus you understanding what illness is. There's a very big difference between the knowledge that a physician will have if he is one who does surgery to be able to remove cancerous tumors. That is very different from the knowledge of the person who is dying of cancer because he has a tumor.
Yeah.
That knowledge is not the same. You were never intended to know cancer by having it kill you, by having it inside you and destroying you. But rather, the knowledge that you should have had is being able to understand it as something that can kill. Now you experiencing its death.
Yeah.
So again, to go back to that tree of knowledge of good and evil, there are some who would argue and say, well, if it's so bad and they were never supposed to eat from it, then why did he create it? Assuming that the tree is in and of itself intrinsically evil.
Yeah. But that's just not the case. And I think that it's really important to see that it's not the case. First of all, in the tradition of the fathers, you see that clearly 100%. That's not the case. But then not only that, then you see it play out in the story of Christ, where then the mystery of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is actually completely revealed in the story of Christ. And it's bothersome. Like, it really is bothersome. And you realize that this is the one that's hardest, at least for me, it's kind of the hardest to grasp, because it seems like it seems like in the story of the fall, it seems like both God and the serpent were kind of telling the truth, but you had to take both at the same time, right? So God says, if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll die. And the serpent says, no, he said, if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you become like God. And Jesus seems to say yes to both of those for some reason. Like Jesus is on the cross, with the good thief and the bad thief, with the knowledge of good and evil. That's what's going on the cross, right? He's eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and he's dying, but he's also God. It's the weirdest thing. The story of Jesus is just really weird. Like, because it seems to kind of collapse the story of the garden. It's as if, like, you could get this sense, like, this is the thing that I wonder when I read the story of Adam. Like, if Adam had eaten the fruit and had been willing to die, maybe that would have been different. Maybe it would have been like receiving it from God. Because when he after that, when God says, did you eat the fruit? He's like, nah, it's her fault. He does exactly what you would expect as someone who is fallen. He's prideful and he opposes himself to everything, right? He's now separated himself from the world. He used to be the king.
Right. He
used to be the one who was supposed to be over creation and over nature, and was supposed to have dominion over all things. And now he's saying, it's not my fault. It's their fault. It's all their fault. It's like he's immediately subjected himself to that which was below. Right. Like he's immediately flipped his own position by refusing what happened, right? And like blaming everybody else, including God. He says, the woman that you gave me. And so it's like completely enacting the fall right there, right? Yeah. As soon as he eats the fruit, he's already completely enacting the fall. Right. And then when you think of Christ in the garden. So Christ goes into the garden too, just before he is arrested. He goes into the garden, goes up the mountain. By the way, there's you can see that he's going up the mountain because he keeps saying that he goes down. The disciples wait for him below. That's right. And he keeps saying that he goes down to see the disciples, and he goes up to pray to God. So it's like, it's telling you, it's in a garden. It's on a mountain. Yeah, he's going back into the Garden of Eden. And he's like the very opposite of Adam, because he's got this fruit. He's got the cup that he's supposed to drink, but he says, I don't want the cup. Like, God, if you can, take this away from me. I don't want the cup. And then it's God who says, no, you have to take it. You have to take the cup, and you die, and you'll be elevated. All of that. And it's like, so he kind of plays through the story of the fall of the Garden of Eden, flips it completely on its head, turns it into his glorification, but also really it's glorification. Like when we see Christ on the cross, we say he was elevated. Like, what is happening? Like everything has been collapsed in the story of Jesus. Right. Sorry, we're not supposed to talk about that. We're supposed to talk about just the garden. But, but the only way to understand the story of the Garden of Eden is to really bring it into Christ, because he just, he smashes it. Well, actually, there's no way we're going to avoid speaking about Jesus, because if you're going to speak about the tree of life, the fathers would actually teach us very clearly that the tree of life is reintroduced on Golgotha. Yeah, it's the cross. And the fruit that hangs on the tree of life that now gives you and I access to immortality is the very body and blood of Christ that hangs on this tree, that we as the church now reach up to, take and partake of, so that we may be able to taste immortality and eternity with him. Yeah. So there's no avoiding talking about Jesus. And the cross this is what's wild too. It's like Jesus on the cross is both trees. Yeah, so I need you to unpack that for us. And it's not just both trees, it's all of the trees. It's all the trees are there in the story of the crucifixion of Christ, by the way. You ever think about that? No, so you're gonna have to help. It's not that complicated. So the final tree in the Garden of Eden is what? The one at the bottom is the thorns. Right. The consequence of the fall, God says. This is the consequence of the fall. So Christ says, oh, really? Well, I'm going to take that and I'm going to wear it as a crown. That's crazy. And the only way to understand the cursing of the fig tree is through the story of Genesis. There's no other way to understand it. What is that weird story in the gospel where Jesus curses the fig tree? And he says to the fig tree, like, your fruit you've not been fruitful, so he's cursing the fig tree. And Saint Ephrem and like other saints, they say this is Christ basically undoing the fall. Because when Adam and Eve fall, they cover themselves with fig leaves. And so Christ says, I'm going to remove the covering, right? I'm removing the covering that you put on yourself. And then I'm going to move naked into the cross. And so his nakedness on the cross is Adam and Eve in the garden too. And he goes in, and then he has on the cross the good thief and the bad thief. He has the tree of the knowledge of good and evil on the cross, but it's also the tree of life at the same time.
Right.
I mean, and it's the garden because the water flows from his side, and he's the Garden of Eden.
He's on
He's
the
a new
mount.
creation.
And the church
He's
is
on the
born,
mountain.
The church is born from his side.
That's right. Just like Eve is born
from
from his side. I mean, it's really, the story of Jesus just drives you crazy. Because it's just like, you think you get it, and then you keep looking at it, you're like, oh, I missed that. How did I miss that? And once you see it, you're like, how did I miss that?
Isn't that beautiful though?
It's amazing.
That
It's
is
astounding.
incredible.
You can't come up with a story like
There's so
that.
many levels.
There's no way. There's no way. And the only people that think that you can is because they can't see it. They're blinded.
I think that's the beauty of scripture as a whole. It has so many depths, so many different angles, right? And it's more and more beautiful once you look into all of them.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's not this or that. Sometimes it's this and that.
This and that. I would totally agree. Yeah.
You touched on nakedness for just a second. You talked about how it is that now he approaches and he goes to the cross willfully, completely naked.
Yeah.
But there was a point in time in creation where he created them naked and they were unashamed.
Yeah.
So they choose to cover themselves up once their eyes were opened. How are we supposed to understand this? Because today you and I would talk about how, no, it's inappropriate to be naked.
Yeah.
It's not right. We have to be covered.
Yeah. Well, the best way to understand it is really in the idea of Adam blaming the others. That's really what he's doing when he's covering himself, because you could understand that in some ways, Adam, obviously all the things in creation are
Covering yourself. That just hit me right
Yeah,
now.
you saw it, right? So you can imagine all the things in creation are distinct, but they're not separate in the way that we think of separation, right? They are united. Like the Adam and Eve are separated, like they're separated into two beings, but they are meant to be, they're one at the same time, right? And the same thing with creation. The way that creation functions is that all the beings are separate, but they are kind of united into Adam by him naming them and all that. And so what happens at the fall is that Adam, because of his fall into multiplicity and his loss of that role of true dominion over creation, now he sees everything as a threat. Everything is not only separate from me, but dangerous to me. And so that woman, she's responsible for what I did. And the snake. And then ultimately now the whole world is going to be against me. And then the thorns are going to prick at me, and everything is and the beasts of the field are going to attack me. And all of a sudden I need to protect myself from the world. And so that is why they cover themselves as a kind of protection.
Right.
Which, I mean, like, it makes so much sense now when you look at the Lord praising the man standing at the back, calling himself a sinner, and just confessing. Can't even look up. He says, Son of David, have mercy on me, or God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Because that's what we are. Like that's what we really are. There's a vulnerability there. There's a nakedness in confessing that. And he's like, that guy's justified.
Yeah.
Whereas the Pharisee's standing in the front and he's dressed up. He's adorning himself. Look, I've paid my tithes. I pray all the time. I fast all the time.
Yeah. And so, but then this is the mystery of the question of clothing. It's really important to kind of see the double symbolism. It's a multiple symbolism, but it's the same. But so a way of understanding it is that when you go down the mountain, we talk about going down the mountain, right? If you go down the mountain in the fullness of God, because you can do that, right? I told you, St. Ephrem talks about the saints moving down the mountain and walking on the waters, because all of creation is what God willed. If you do that, then the garments, you could say, the exteriority of yourself, they become garments of glory, right? And so it's not that you can understand the covering as a kind of glory, as a kind of extension of the original thing. But then if you lose that, right? If you cut yourself off from that, then the garments become dead garments. They become garments of skin, which is what God gives them when they fall. He's giving them garments of death, right? And so these garments of death are now this exteriority, but not connected to the inner aspect. And that's really important to understand, because that's why at the end, when you get to Revelation, I mean, people aren't naked. In Revelation, people are clothed in the white robe of glory, right? Because they've reached the end connected to the beginning.
Right.
And so then what happens, like after the fall, nakedness can become a kind of shame, a kind of desacralization.
Right.
Right. So the tabernacle needs veils, because we're like incapable of seeing the nakedness of the glory of God. And so we have to cover it in order to encounter it. And it's proper. It's the proper way to encounter it. So if you think about the story in Genesis before the fall, you have the nakedness of Adam in the garden, and then you have the nakedness of Noah after the flood.
Right.
And that's the nakedness of shame.
Right.
Right. Drunken nakedness.
That his son
a
wants
loss
to
of control, and a kind of loss of your external means, where you lose your way of interacting with the world, and you kind of you find yourself naked, to expose to everybody. And then the image of exposing nakedness in scripture then becomes an image of a shameful thing.
That's right.
And so, but then again, Jesus collapses them. Jesus collapses them together. His nakedness on the cross is both the glory and the shame at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he also goes up on Tabor, and in the transfiguration, doesn't say that he shone like the sun while being naked.
No, it was the garments of glory.
The garment that shined brighter than the sun,
Yeah.
it says. It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
So let's move from something beautiful to something a little bit more. In this story, there's a serpent. And the serpent decides that he is going to contradict the Lord and say, you're not going to die. And he speaks to Eve, and Eve has full-blown conversation with the serpent. What's up with the serpent? Why is he talking to Eve? Why is he in the garden? Why was he let in? There's so much here that we could talk about.
Yeah. So there were different ways to represent it. You can represent it in the icons. Often we represent the serpent as kind of coiled around the tree. It's a totally proper way of representing it. We can understand it that way. Saint Ephrem, in order to help you understand, will say that the serpent was outside of the garden, and that Adam and Eve would have to come down to the gate of the garden and then encounter the serpent. There are different ways of thinking about it. Like some of the hesychastic fathers, they say things like, there's a serpent, your heart is like paradise, but there's also a serpent in your heart, at the bottom of your heart. And that the serpent is kind of coiled at the bottom of your heart. But you also have a heaven in your heart as well, right? So the best way of understanding the serpent is something like an image of chaos, like an image of change, an image of variation. It's the diabolos, if you want to think about it just in terms of the term. It's something like change in multiplicity and variety. And then change in multiplicity and variety can become the Satan also, because they can oppose unity, right? So the diabolos, the divider, can also be the opponent, because that makes sense to think about it simply. Like the challenge to unity can come from the multiple, right? Saying, what is your pretension of being above us? Can't we exist on our own? Like, why do we need something above us? Can't we just self-rule? Why can't we self-rule? That's the opponent, right? That's the diabolos that's speaking. So the serpent is the perfect image of that for a lot of reasons. One is the reason is that a serpent is the only being that can be in two places at once, right? It is shifty. It's changing. It's not stable. It changes its skin. It's everything about it. It crawls on the ground, right? It eats dust, as God says in the scripture. So it's something like that. It's something like variety, something like change. It's something like the diabolos, like the Satan. It's all of that. But you have to really, again, understand that this serpent or change or chaos or the monsters or all of that is part of creation. It's not something that is necessarily evil at the outset. for example, like a good example would be the monster, the sea monsters, right? The Leviathan is a great example.
Mm-hmm.
So in Genesis, it says that God creates the sea monsters, the Tannin, right? The great creatures of the sea. That's how they translate it in the King James, but it's like, it's the monsters. That's what it is, the sea monsters. And the Leviathan is like the ultimate sea monster. And there are places in scripture where the Leviathan is a representation of God's power out into the world.
Yeah.
Right. In Job, in the Psalms, also, like the Leviathan is represented as like this frolicking creature out it's almost like God's pet, that's out there in the waters. But then sometimes Leviathan is also represented as the opponent, right? As the diabolos in that sense. And then ultimately at the end in Revelation, there's this, we just slam it all together and we say the Leviathan, that great Satan, is finally pierced and destroyed by Saint Michael, and it says I think it's in Isaiah where it says that the Leviathan, that Yahweh will at some point destroy the Leviathan, will kill the Leviathan. And that's actually turning the sea into glass, by the way. It's the same idea. There are amazing images in Jewish tradition about how this ends. Like they have this feast of the Leviathan. They actually eat the Leviathan at the end. Like
really?
In their traditions, yeah.
Wow.
They say that the skins of the Leviathan are the skins of the Jerusalem, of the third temple. Like,
wow.
Anyways, so that's kind of the way to understand it. St. John Chrysostom says something like that the serpent was something like a dog for Adam, like Adam's pet, until it fell. Then when it fell, then it became the opponent. That's a way to understand it. It's like the multiplicity and change and is not bad. It's good, but you don't listen to that. You listen to what comes from heaven. That's where you get your instructions. You get your instructions from the unity, not from the multiplicity.
Right.
Adam is meant to have dominion over that multiplicity. So the structure, this is actually my brother, he's the first one to point that out to me. He's like amazing insight. He basically shows you in the text, like Adam is supposed to name the animals. So he's speaking and they're listening. It's pretty simple, right? He's the image of God and he's giving names and he's telling them who they are. And now they participate in their being based on that. Now we have this weird situation. It's like, now it's the snake speaking. And now Eve is listening to the snake and it's like a inversion of where order is supposed to come from. And the snake is trying to reveal to Adam his identity.
Wow.
Right? But his identity is not supposed to come from that. It's supposed to come from above. So the whole thing, and then getting Adam to pick the tree for himself is all an image. The same images are all kind of playing with each other here. Where the serpent is saying, I'm going to tell you who you are. And actually if you do this for yourself, then you will be like God,
He's still doing that.
Yeah.
Right? He's still telling our kids and our people, the accuser. He's the accuser. You're not loved. You don't belong. You're horrible. And
so you really have to be able to kind of understand that in some ways the serpent is a normal part of creation. So the question of saying, why did God create the serpent? It's like, well, why did God create earth? Why did God create multiplicity? Why did God create variety? Why did God create change? Why did God create, it's like, this is actually part of the world. It's just that things have to be ordered properly in order for them. And you could even ask the question, why did God create Satan? Like, why did God create it's like that which is distinct from God, has its function, but it takes its being when it looks to its origin. But as soon as it tries to take it on itself, that's when it becomes the cause of the fall.
Right.
And so if you want to kind of understand this image of the opponent or the Satan, you see it in the story of St. Peter very clearly. It's a beautiful image of the structure where, it's really fascinating because even the text of St. Peter, when when Christ says, "Get behind me, Satan," it's powerful how it's structured because Peter is Christ's representative. It's like he recognizes the Messiah and Christ says, you're the stone, on this I'm going to build you. And then the next episode right after is Christ saying, and I need to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to suffer. And St. Peter's like, no, And then Christ says,
Get
behind me, Satan. Right. So you can see it's like he's trying to control it. He's trying to hold it. Doesn't want the sacrifice. He doesn't want to understand that Christ has to give himself up. Right. He can't hold on to his life. Peter says, hold on to it. And then Christ says, now you're the opponent. Even though you were the angel, right? Very much like the story of Satan. He's saying, I chose you to be my representative. And now because you want to take the power, now I'm describing you as my opponent, right? And in the case of Peter, obviously there's a reconciliation, ultimately with that, but it's to help you see the structure. That's what is happening in the Garden of Eden. It's the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we've spoken so much about this idea of, again, like you said with Peter, like you're trying to take for yourself what is not yours. The direction of what is ordered comes from the top down. It should not ever change in its direction. They receive it from the wrong direction. They rebel against God. And in the process, there is this massive event, this state that the church calls the fall. And when they are fallen, we're immediately told their eyes were opened and they knew that they were naked. What is this opening of the eyes that we're supposed to understand? Were they meant to have a veil? Was there supposed to be blindness?
Yeah. And so I think that this is where the text gets tricky. This is at least the way that I understand it, is that this is also where it's interesting because this is where the Gnostics get it wrong. Because some Gnostics, and even like Jung and people like that, they see that. They're like, well, it says that their eyes were open. And so they have more than what they had before. And the truth is that in some ways that's kind of true in the sense that they received something that they weren't ready for.
That's right.
Right. And because they received that which is they weren't ready for, then they fall. You could also say that in the proper, like when the priest goes into the holy place, he removes the veil and is prepared and then goes in appropriately and then can encounter the glory of God. But like if you touch the ark or you go into the Holy of Holies and not are prepared, then that kills you.
That's right.
Right. And that's what happened. So in some ways they had a revelation of God, but because they tried to contain it for themselves, it became the thing that scared them and forced them to protect themselves and to cover themselves from God and then from each other. And then ultimately things started to break down and to separate. So that's kind of the way, I think that's the best way to kind of understand that with a kind of generosity in the text, is that it is an image in some ways of revelation, but it's an image of improper revelation, right. of a revelation that is not received by something that is someone who is ready for receiving it.
So let me supplement the question just a little bit further, because there's this one passage in Genesis chapter 3 that I wrestled with for quite some time in trying to understand what it meant. The serpent tells them, you will not die, but on the contrary, the day that you will eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God. And then as soon as after they fall, there seems to be this dialogue where God himself confirms their eyes are now open and they have become like us. Yeah. What is he referring to? What is it? I mean, I thought he created us to be like him.
Yeah. Well, it's always the same thing. It's always that, this image of, let's say this image of the cosmic image of the devil that we have, kind of in our Christian mythology. God makes this highest angel. And then that's what God made him to be. But as soon as he declares that for himself, then it becomes a lie. It becomes an error. And it's the same. We say things like Christ, God became man so that man would become God. But if you stand up in church and you say, I am a God, I hope they kick you out. Like,
absolutely.
I hope they pick you and
blasphemy.
Throw you out of the church,
100%.
right? And so that is the difference. And it's really, it sounds like it's a subtle difference, but it is everything.
It's everything.
It's everything. And I think that is what is happening. So you could understand it like, and you see the same thing happen in the story of the Tower of Babel, right? Where it says they're going to build a tower, they're going to make a name for themselves. And then God sees and says, they're going to accomplish what they want. And then God breaks down the languages in order to prevent that. And you think, wow, is he like
is he that petty?
Is he petty? Is he just a jealous, petty God in that sense? But the best way to understand it is maybe a good way of kind of understanding hell, right? It's to understand that if you move towards pride, right, and let's say you're frozen in that moment where you think that you're bringing divinity into yourself, you better hope that you die. Because if you don't, that's what hell is. Because then you're going to be, how can I say this?
Exposed.
The idea of like a permanent state of standing with a lie or like a false identity in the presence of God and being faced with that. That's ultimately what some of the fathers describe hell to be, right? It's like you have this thing, this obstacle, and now you're standing in the presence of God. So the way of understanding it is that you can see it as God casting them out, and that is completely appropriate to understand it. But you could also see it as them running away. That's what they do. They cover themselves right away. They're already outside of the garden.
And they hid themselves from him.
By the time that they put the garments, the fig leaves on them, they're already outside of the garden for all intents and purposes. They've already left the state in which they were meant to be. And so you can see it both ways. You can see it both as God is casting them out, but they are also running away from God at the same time.
Right. And if you contrast what happens in that first garden, if we go back to, again, becoming like God, you have in the first garden where they grasp for themselves this idea, we want divinity for ourselves. We want to be our own gods. We do not want an authority above us. We become the authority. Yeah. Versus in the garden where the Lord's last plea and last cry, when he speaks to his good father, is that they may be one just as we are one. And this is where we understand this idea of how it is that we're called to union, called to sanctification, partakers of the divine nature, that he wants to offer it to us. Claim it for yourself. Then you find yourself in that state that you describe, which is hellish.
And it's like, and this is, it's weird because it really is the way that things function. Like all the time in your life, you're faced with that dilemma all the time, which is that you have things that are good in your life. And sometimes you try to grasp them. You try to catch them. You're like, this is mine. Yeah. I got this. This is my precious. As soon as you do that, it loses its value. And that's what most sins are. I mean, is it wrong to eat? It's wonderful to eat. We're called to feast in scripture. We're called to enjoy the things that God has given us. But if I say, now I got, like, this is my pleasure. This is my thing. This is the thing that gives me life. This is the thing that gives me purpose. Then all of a sudden it becomes death.
Right.
And that's true about sex. It's true about food. It's true about riches. It's true about anything, right? Anything that is good and that God gives us, as soon as we try to grab onto it on its own, then it becomes death.
Yes.
And so it's like, it's what the Garden of Eden is describing, like I keep saying from the beginning, is your reality every day. It's describing the highest version of that, but it's something we go through all the time.
So if that's death, what's life? If death is taking, what's life?
Well, that's it. I mean, this is the mystery of Christianity, is that it's self-sacrifice seems to be the way to reach life. It's like it looks like a paradox, right? Because you think, well, okay, so I have to die in order to live. Jesus says that. I don't know what that means, but obviously Jesus manifested in the highest form. But that notion is something, again, that you experience all the time. Like you can test it out if you want. Think about, I like to use the image of a sports team. It's like a very simple way of understanding it. It's like, I don't know, you're playing hockey. You like to play hockey. Now, if you want to be a good hockey player, you have to give your talent to the team. You cannot keep it for yourself. If you keep it for yourself, you'll lose, your team will lose, and you will be a horrible hockey player. You have to sacrifice your talent for a higher good. And when you do that, then the glory comes back down on you, right? So it's like, it's the same with everything that we do. It's like if I eat just to eat because I want that pleasure, then I lose it. But if I sit with my family in a loving conversation and then we eat together and we feast, the joy that brings me is far more than the one that I have if I just want to get my kick. I want to get my pleasure. And it's the same with sex. Like in a relationship with your wife, if you try to just take, then you lose.
That's right.
But if you come together in a loving union where you give yourself to the other person, then you get everything. And you could think, you could just weaponize that, right? You could be tricky and try to pretend no, it doesn't work. Like you actually have to engage in the self-sacrificial manner in reality. And then the surprise of it yielding tenfold, and then you realize everything Jesus says. That's what Jesus is saying all the time. When he says you have to die so you live, you have to, it's like you have to sit in the back, like that like, why? What is that weird thing? It's like if you sit in the back and then they call you to the front, that's the glory. But if you sit in the front and you don't deserve it, what is that? That's
shame.
That's shame.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's shame. I think Christ even alludes to this when he talks about his own life. He specifically uses that language. No one takes it from me. It is me who offers it up for the life of the world. So when you say, what is life? I'm curious.
I mean, that's what it is. It's actually the giving up,
Yeah.
and that's why, that's how you can then also understand all the sacrificial system in the Old Testament. It's saying the best thing that you have, first thing you do, you give it up. Give it up. Give it up to God. If you do that, then you will have blessing. But if you try to keep it all, then you lose it.
You really see that Christ heals everything. In his being the second Adam, he heals every single movement by giving himself up.
Yeah, and so we don't we're not all called to become martyrs. Obviously, that is the highest vision of this. But in your everyday life, you're called to do that all the time. Every time you sacrifice what you want to be responsible father or a loving husband or a member of your parish or whatever it is that you're doing, every time you do that and you do it truly and faithfully, you are receiving glory.
Yeah.
Like glory is falling down back on you, and you have a type of joy, and it's real too. Like you have a type of joy that is difficult to describe. Whereas if you try to cling and you try to grab and you try to hold on, then you're always afraid of losing what you think you have. And the monks, that's what they tell us. They tell us this. They try to tell us this. We don't like it.
We run away from it.
Yeah, we like our stuff. Just like all of everyone.
Yeah.
It's really incredible how just Christ flips everything on its head, only to reveal what is real, what is true, and not the other way around. So they find themselves in this situation. They believe the serpent. Their eyes are open. They realize they are naked. They hide from God. They are ashamed. And then the Lord has this conversation with them. He says, who told you that you were naked? And he knows the answers to these questions. He asks, where are you? He says, who told you that you were naked? And then it turns into the blame game. First of all, it's your fault, the woman that you gave me. And then he turns and blames the woman, and the woman blames the serpent. And then you have this conversation of curses and consequences. How do we...
What does this make sense of all this? So the curses are are very coherent. A way of understanding the curses is something like it's just the consequences of the fall. It's the consequences of trying to hold on to power, hold on to something, and then falling into multiplicity. That's what happens. And so if you look at the three curses, they mirror each other. They have the same structure of the three curses, and so he starts and he tells the serpent, he says, you are now cursed among the beasts, and now you will lie in the dust and you'll eat the dust, and then you will try to bite at the heel of Adam, right? And then his descendants will crush your head, right? So you have a structure. So you have this thing in the multiplicity, right? Remember, it's wallowing in the multiplicity. Because of that, it tries to come up and take over, or the structure, take over that which is supposed to have dominion. And then because of that, the person that is above now has to impose his will on that which is below, right? Because before Adam, it was this natural thing. He would just name the animals. It was a beautiful natural process, but now it's no, it's going to crush your head, right? So then you take that and you take the next one. The next one has the same structure. He tells the woman, he says, now you will suffer in producing multiplicity, right? So you're going to produce many, but that will be pain to you, right? It won't be like before where you are multiplying some of the spirituality to talk about how the way in which Adam and Eve were meant to multiply was more like naming the animals. It was like their influence was supposed to fill the world. And it was this beautiful kind of ordering of creation that they were supposed to engage in. But now, because of the fall, now Eve will produce the multiplicity, but in pain.
In pain.
And then she will desire for her husband, and her husband will dominate her. Right? It's the same structure.
That's wild.
Right. And then Adam, it's the same thing. He says, you used to receive these fruits from above.
Not anymore.
But now you have to work the ground, right? What's below. And not only that, but the earth will produce thorns, right? So thorns is something like multiplicity attacking you, right? So it's multiple points. It's like all these sticky, prickly things that go in all these directions. And now they are attacking you. And it's like by the sweat of your brow, you're going to have to dominate the earth in order to get food from an earth that is attacking you. Just like the serpent came up, just like the woman desired for her husband, and you're going to have to kind of dominate that. And at the end, from dust you came, and to dust you will return. And remember what he said at the beginning. I said, you'll be eaten by the serpent is what he's also suggesting. Because he says to the serpent, you're going to eat the dust of the earth. And he says to Adam, you'll become the dust of the earth. There's this weird cyclical thing going on where it's like, it's very powerful, right? It's like this Ouroboros shape, it's like now this cycle of death that you're going to deal with. And so then you can understand, it's really important to understand that, because we tend to think about death only as the breakdown into dust. That's how we tend to think about death. It's the best way to understand death, right? Death is when multiplicity doesn't fit to unity. That's what decomposition is, right? So you have a bunch of stuff in your body. They're all dancing together towards a single purpose. And then something happens. The spirit leaves. And now all this multiplicity starts to go its own way and starts to break down. None of it goes away. Right. None of the things in your body goes away. They just start to split apart. Right, and to break down. And that's what death is. But there's another aspect of death, which is something like tyranny, which is something like excessive order, right? That's the crushing of the serpent. That's the oppression of the woman. And then also like Adam having to impose his will on the earth.
And it's rebellion against him.
Yeah. And so but both of them go together. So on the one hand, the multiplicity, the serpent like trying to eat you, and then you trying to spear the serpent. We have a beautiful image of that, which is St. Michael, right? Killing the serpent.
That's right.
Like you have this beautiful image. It's like the serpent's trying to come and eat you, and now you have to spear it down. That is the consequence, you could say, of the fall. And so both civilization and its violence is descendant of that. But then also the kind of breakdown, lasciviousness, the kind of falling into your own desire, that kind of breakdown of your being into multiplicity is also part of it.
Right.
And you can follow that story all through Scripture. Those two aspects, like the excess of order and the excess of chaos, kind of playing with each other, playing against each other.
So at this point, they've heard the curses, they're cast out. And now they find themselves in this reality where, again, it's them against the serpent, them against the land, them against each other. The order that was set forth that was supposed to be paradise to them, access to the kingdom, has now all been dissolved because of the fall. But you have this one sentence in the story right before the creation narrative ends. The Lord places a cherub right in front of the tree to guard paradise, to prevent them from accessing the tree of life.
What's going on? It's like, what's going on with the cherub? So there are several ways of understanding the cherub, but there are two things. There's a cherub and there's a flaming sword.
Right.
And so you could understand it similar to what I said before, is that it's the negative or the aspect of multiplicity and the aspect of unity that is keeping you out. Right. So it's like acting as a guard towards that which is higher. And so the cherub is 4, right? The cherub is just, it's like the four rivers. You could think about it that way. But now these four is no longer, it's preventing you from accessing the one. But it could also, in other circumstances, be a kind of throne for the one, right? It could be in another circumstance, a kind of guardian of the one, or even a way to the one. But in this circumstance, it's now preventing you from accessing it. So that's why it's important to understand, because then the cherub in the Bible will have those two aspects. So in this case, it's like it's there on the edge, and it is now this four that is preventing you from seeing the one because you're fallen. But in Ezekiel, it's the throne.
That's right.
Right. In Ezekiel, it's the chariot that is manifesting the one in the world. And so that's why for us, the cherub, the tetramorph, is the four gospels that come down from Christ and manifest on the four corners of the world, the unity of God. But in this case, it's because they're fallen, then it becomes an obstacle. And then the flaming sword is something like the manner in which unity cuts, the manner in which unity judges. So unity does two things, right? The purpose of something is both that which draws you into it, but also it's the thing that judges you. Or think about a team again. Think about a hockey team. It's like you play for the Montreal Canadiens, let's say, and so that's what brings you into the hockey. Like, so you're a member of the team. It brings you there, and now the fact of the team is what makes you play hockey. So you're there and you're playing hockey in the name of the Montreal Canadiens, which brings you to unity. But it's also your judge, right? It's also deciding whether you're worthy of being in the team or not, constantly. And that's true of all forms of unity, right? Unity is always something which draws you in, and also that which judges you, because it's an ideal. It's like a purpose. It's a goal. And so the flaming sword is like unity, but just the unity that judges you. Right? You can sometimes call it a two-edged sword.
Right.
Right. So that's why Christ has that coming out of his mouth at the last judgment. It's the same sword, or it's St. Michael's sword.
Right. Right.
It's a sword with which he kills the Leviathan.
Why does he explicitly say it's to guard them from accessing the tree of life? Why now? I thought the tree of life was an option.
What do you mean?
When he places the cherub at the door of paradise, it mentions specifically that it's to guard access to the tree of life.
Yes, to prevent Adam from accessing the tree of life. But it's also to guard, you could say it's also to grant access to the tree of life. It guards, but a guard does both. Right? The guard is that which prevents you from entering, but also that which gives you access to. So that's why the cherub is on the Ark of the Covenant, right? You have the two cherubs that are like a throne for the glory of God, or that they're on the veils of the temple. All of these make sense. So it's like it's both something that prevents you, but if you're worthy, it's also that which grants access. Right. So that's why, like, the idea of the throne, the chariot in Ezekiel, the Merkabah, right, the flaming chariot. You see that in the early images of the ascension of Christ, where under Christ's feet, you see the cherub, you see the four faces. Like in the Rabula Gospels, for example, like 6th century Gospels, you see that it's like he's got the four faces.
Interesting.
And so it's like, it's bringing him into heaven, bringing him into paradise.
Right. You have a person like St. Gregory the theologian who talks about this idea about how it is that even placing that guard in front of paradise was a form of mercy and love that was shown to them.
Yeah.
To prevent them from being able to now become eternally or immortally in a state of death.
Yeah.
But how he doesn't keep that prevention. His intention is to reintroduce the tree of life in the form of the cross of Christ, of which we partake of his fruit.
Yeah.
So I guess to bring all of this together into the good news story of what it is that Christ does for us on the cross, bring us to Golgotha for just a second. So
So the story of the story of the cross, like I alluded to before, in some ways it's just it kind of collapses all of this together, because what it does is it flips the fall, right? It flips the fall into glory, and Christ does it in many ways. There are different aspects of what he does that is kind of flipping the fall into glory, and he changes the fall. On the one hand, it's weird because you'd think like Christ is bringing us back into the garden, and definitely he's doing that, but he's not doing it in a strange way, which is that he's also filling the world of the fall with himself. And so he's also making he's transforming images into the fall into images of glory. And that's what's the wildest aspect of it. And that's why, it's so hard to understand Christianity. But once you kind of get a glimpse of that, you kind of realize that Christianity is all about death. It's all about death to yourself, right? It's, the martyrs. Why are the martyrs? Why do we like martyrs? It's like they die, they go and they get eaten by wild beasts. They seem to be actually going through the curse that was given to Adam.
Yeah.
Like they're ripped apart. All this, you're like, what is happening? Why is that part of something that is? Because we realize that there's a relationship between death and glory. Interestingly enough, this is actually really fascinating. People can look this up in the St. Vladimir's Press little translation of St. Ephraim's The Hymns on Paradise. There's a beautiful introduction by Sebastian Brock at the beginning. And in this introduction, he asks question about this idea that we have in the Christian tradition about the garments of glory, right? We have this idea in the Christian tradition that Adam and Eve in the garden had garments of glory, and that when we say they were naked, they were actually clothed in glory. You see that in St. Gregory of Nyssa, you see that in several of the fathers, and that when they fall, they were given garments of skin. But the question is, where does that come from? Because where do you see that in the Bible? You don't see that. And Sebastian Brock points to first century rabbinical interpretations that talk about these garments of glory and where they get it from. And where they get it from is the text that says that they were given garments of skin. That in fact, the word garment, the word skin in that context means something like it has to do with extension. So it could be interpreted both as raise, and also death. And so there's this idea that the rabbi saw the same thing as being garments of glory and garments of death, right? So you have these weird interpretations. You've probably seen this. In the West, there are images of Moses when he comes down the mountain with horns on his head.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That's because there's a relationship between rays of light and horns of animal.
Interesting.
And so there's this idea that when Moses came down, that he was disfigured, but that it was also glory. So what I'm getting to is that there seems to be right there in the text and in the tradition, this idea that there's actually a relationship between death and glory, that in fact, one can become the other. So you can think of it as the move into multiplicity, right? The move into multiplicity can be either a breakdown of one into the many, or it can be the radiance of the one into the many. And therefore, that's why the symbolism of death in Christianity gets collapsed, where in fact, we recapture the symbolism of death into its image as glory. And that it seems so paradoxical when you see it, because you're like, why do we have relics? What the heck is going on? Why do we kiss these dead people's bodies? What is happening? But it's there's something about this idea that in fact, this body, this corrupt body
is emanating,
can be a vehicle for glory. This garment of skin that we have, this biological dead body, can become a vehicle for glory. And that's what's happening on the cross. That's what's happening with the martyrs. And that's also what's happening with relics.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's weird because it's so paradoxical, but it's hard. We're so used to some of the things that we believe as Christians that we sometimes we don't see how they're how they fit together this beautiful puzzle. We say of course we martyrs. Of course we celebrate these people that died for their faith. What? You celebrate people getting eaten by lions? You understand why the Romans were these people are crazy. But once you see that in fact, that is actually the structure of reality. That those that give themselves, that are willing to die to themselves, even in the small ways, not just in the getting eaten by a lion way, but like the small ways, they participate in a higher glory necessarily. As much, even the Montreal Canadiens, like even the Montreal Canadian player that sacrifices his skill to sacrifices himself for the team will receive glory from the Montreal Canadiens that he would not have if he tried to just hold it for himself.
Right.
But that is true of everything. It's true of your family, of your job, and ultimately it's true of our salvation. It's true of the church.
Absolutely.
I mean, the Lord says it, right? The seed has to be buried.
Must die.
Absolutely.
That's
Must
right.
die.
Absolutely. There is so much that we discussed today. This was wonderful.
Very enlightening.
Yeah.
Truly.
I'm curious if fathers, any final thoughts or questions for Jonathan?
Just thank you.
Oh, this is a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks
Thanks
so
for having
much.
me.
Father Gabriel, any
Father
thoughts?
Anthony.
You've been really quiet. You've been taking a lot of this in.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Why would I speak when Jonathan is here? Might as well listen and learn. Thank you so much,
Thank you
Jonathan.
for having me.
Any final thoughts for us, Jonathan, or for the audience?
No, I would just say that, it's all there. Like it's all there in our traditions. And sometimes we are jaded, or we not jaded, but we kind of take things for granted. We're used to it. We've become accustomed to some of the things we do and some of the things we participate in. And I think that when Christ says that we need to be like children, there's a way in which we kind of have to not forget, but, approach things again with a fresh vision. And then, we realize how beautiful, how the story of Jesus is just beyond belief, and how we have this treasure.
Absolutely.
But the Christian tradition is a treasure that we were given.
Yeah. I have a fellow priest who serves with me in the city of Ottawa. Celebrated 2 years ago. He celebrated 50 years of priesthood, and I was asking him, like, depending on the readings of the liturgical calendar, there's some gospel readings that you have to give a sermon for over and over again, multiple times a year, and you've done it for 50 straight years. Like, do you find yourself in a situation where it's repetitive? And he told me, I promise you, in 50 years, I have not repeated a single sermon once, because every time I approach the gospel, there is something new that is revealed, that is beautiful, that is pulling me in to be able to see the same tapestry, but from a completely different lens.
Yeah.
And I think you've invited us to be able to recognize the beauty of that tapestry and how it all fits in together. We are so happy that you dedicated this time to be with us and to share with us and to share with the audience.
My
And
fellow
we are
Quebecois, it's really
absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for sharing this time with us, Jonathan. And thank you to the audience for, this has now been 2 hours or so that we've been going at it. What a blessing.
Right.
Thank you. God bless your service. God bless your ministry. For those of you who are interested in being able to find a little bit more about what it is that Jonathan shares, the Symbolic World, he has both his website, the YouTube channel. He does an incredible amount of work with many other YouTubers. He has spoken a little bit about how it is that he has worked with Dr. Jordan Peterson. You can find Jonathan's work all over YouTube and all over the internet. Please, we encourage you to go find out a little bit more. Thank you again, Jonathan. What a blessing.
Thank you, Father. Thanks.